Sarah Mitchell had always believed that love would find her when she least expected it, but she never imagined it would happen in the most ordinary place imaginable, a crowded subway platform during rush hour in Manhattan. Standing at 4 feet 2 inches tall, Sarah had learned to navigate the world with a combination of fierce independence and quiet grace that came from years of proving herself in spaces not designed for someone like her. That Tuesday morning in September, as commuters rushed past her like a human river, Sarah clutched her leather portfolio containing the architectural plans that would change everything. At 28, she had just been promoted to senior architect at Henderson & Associates, one of New York's most prestigious firms. Her innovative designs for accessible housing had caught the attention of the industry, but more importantly, they had caught the attention of someone she never saw coming. Michael Chen was running late for a board meeting when he collided with destiny in the form of Sarah's scattered blueprints. As papers flew everywhere, he found himself on his knees, frantically helping gather the detailed drawings that represented months of Sarah's work. But when he looked up into her eyes, brilliant green eyes that sparkled with intelligence and determination, time seemed to stop. Michael wasn't thinking about her height or the curious stares from passing strangers. He was thinking about how this woman's smile made something inside his chest feel lighter than it had in years. "I'm so sorry," Michael said, carefully handing her the last of the blueprints. "These look incredible. You're an architect." Sarah nodded, expecting the usual patronizing surprise that often followed when people discovered her profession. Instead, Michael's expression showed genuine interest and respect. "I'm Michael Chen, and I think I just ruined your morning, but maybe I can make it up to you with coffee?" What Sarah didn't know was that Michael Chen was the heir to a tech empire worth billions. But what Michael didn't care about was that the world would have opinions about their relationship. Over the next 6 months, their love story unfolded like the most beautiful blueprint either of them had ever seen. Michael discovered that Sarah's brilliance extended far beyond her professional achievements. She spoke 3 languages, had a master's degree in both architecture and urban planning, and possessed a dry sense of humor that could make him laugh until his sides hurt. Sarah, meanwhile, fell in love with Michael's genuine kindness and the way he treated everyone around him with respect, from his company's janitor to his board of directors. When he finally told her about his family's wealth, she simply shrugged and said, "That's nice, but can you cook? Because I'm terrible at it, and we'll need to figure out who's making dinner." Their relationship was built on mutual respect, shared dreams, and a love so genuine that it seemed to glow around them like an aura. The proposal came on a quiet Sunday morning in Central Park, where they often took walks and discussed everything from sustainable architecture to their dreams of traveling the world together. Michael got down on one knee beside the reservoir, and Sarah's tears were not from surprise but from the overwhelming joy of knowing she had found her person. Someone who loved her not despite who she was, but because of exactly who she was. They were planning a small, intimate wedding with their closest friends and family, focusing on what mattered most. Celebrating their love. But love stories, even the most beautiful ones, don't exist in a vacuum, and Sarah was about to discover that not everyone would celebrate their happiness with the same joy that filled their hearts. The engagement party at Michael's parents' Manhattan penthouse should have been a celebration, but Sarah felt like she was walking into a battlefield dressed as a bride-to-be. Victoria Chen, Michael's mother, had spared no expense in creating an elegant soiree that screamed old money and social expectations. Crystal chandeliers cast perfect light on perfect people having perfect conversations about perfectly boring topics, and Sarah found herself wondering if she had somehow stumbled into the wrong life. Victoria's smile was as sharp as her diamond earrings when she introduced Sarah to the guests. "This is Sarah, Michael's friend." The pause before the word friend was loaded with enough subtext to power the city. Sarah felt every conversation pause as she walked by, heard the whispers that people thought were subtle but cut through the air like knives. "Is she really? How does Michael? What will people think?" The questions hung in the air, unfinished but perfectly understood. Michael's father, Richard Chen, was different from his wife but no less formidable. He approached Sarah with the calculating gaze of a man who had built a tech empire from nothing, someone who sized up investments and risks with equal precision. "Sarah, I hear you're an architect. That's practical." His tone suggested that practical was not necessarily a compliment in his world of venture capital and billion-dollar acquisitions. But it was the conversation with Victoria later that evening that truly showed Sarah what she was up against. "You seem like a lovely girl," Victoria began, her voice dripping with the kind of condescension that wealthy people mistake for kindness. "But surely you understand that Michael has responsibilities. Image matters in our world. There are expectations, social obligations, business relationships that require a certain type of wife." She paused, studying Sarah's face. "I'm not saying you're not worthy of love, dear. I'm saying that love isn't always enough." Sarah left the party early, claiming a headache, but the real pain was in her chest where doubt was taking root like a poisonous plant. That night, she stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror of their shared apartment, seeing herself through the eyes of Michael's mother for the first time. Was she being selfish? Was her love for Michael putting him in an impossible position? These questions followed her to bed and haunted her dreams. The next few months became a delicate dance of wedding planning, overshadowed by family tension. Victoria took control of the arrangements with military precision, making decisions that somehow always seemed to emphasize Sarah's differences. The wedding venue was changed to a ballroom with a stage that would require Sarah to walk up 3 steps in front of 300 guests. The photographer was someone known for flattering angles, which apparently meant making the bride look taller. Even the flower arrangements seemed designed to dwarf her further. Meanwhile, Richard began what Sarah recognized as a campaign of subtle psychological warfare. He would casually mention business deals that required the right kind of networking, or charity galas where appearances mattered. He never said Sarah couldn't handle these responsibilities, but his implication was clear. She would be a liability to Michael's career and the family business. The pressure began affecting Michael too, though he tried to hide it. Sarah could see the strain in the way he held his shoulders, hear it in the careful neutrality of his voice when he spoke about wedding details. She knew he was fighting battles on her behalf, having difficult conversations with his parents that he never fully shared with her. Their love remained strong, but it was being tested by forces neither of them had anticipated. 3 weeks before the wedding, Sarah overheard a phone conversation between Victoria and someone she called Aunt Margaret. Victoria's voice carried clearly through the thin walls of the Chen family office. "I've tried everything, Margaret. She's sweet enough, but she's going to ruin his life. Can you imagine the photos? The board meetings? The social events? Michael is brilliant, but he's being naive about the realities of our world." That night, Sarah made a decision that would have broken her heart just months earlier. She would give Michael the choice he deserved, even if it meant walking away from the love of her life. The wedding dress fitting should have been one of the happiest moments of Sarah's life, but instead, it became the moment when her carefully constructed composure finally cracked. The designer Victoria had hired was known for creating gowns for society weddings, and her atelier in the Upper East Side screamed exclusivity from every marble surface and crystal detail. "Well," the designer said, circling Sarah with the critical eye of someone evaluating a problem to be solved, "this will certainly be challenging." She began discussing alterations with Victoria as if Sarah wasn't even in the room. "We'll need to completely restructure the silhouette, perhaps add some vertical elements to create the illusion of height. The train will need to be shortened considerably. We can't have it overwhelming the overall proportions." Sarah stood on the fitting platform, surrounded by mirrors that reflected her image back from every angle, and felt smaller than she had ever felt in her life. But it wasn't her physical stature that was shrinking. It was her sense of self, her confidence, her belief that she belonged in Michael's world. The designer continued making notes about proportion corrections and strategic adjustments, each comment feeling like another small cut. Victoria watched the fitting with the satisfaction of a general seeing her battle plan come together. "I think we should also consider having Sarah walk down the aisle with her father rather than alone," she suggested to the wedding planner. "It might look more balanced." The unspoken word hung in the air. Normal. It might look more normal. That evening, Sarah couldn't bring herself to tell Michael about the fitting. Instead, she lay awake staring at the ceiling of their bedroom, listening to him breathe beside her and trying to memorize the sound. She had spent her entire life proving that she could do anything anyone else could do, often better, but Michael's family was making her question everything she had ever believed about herself. The final straw came at the rehearsal dinner, just 2 days before the wedding. Richard had invited several business associates, and Sarah found herself seated at a table where the conversation naturally drifted to Michael's future with the company. Of course, Michael will need a wife who can handle the social aspects of the business, one of the men was saying. Charity galas, board member dinners, investor meetings. It's really a two-person job at that level. Another man nodded knowingly. My wife does all our entertaining. She's brilliant at making everyone feel comfortable, you know? Makes such a difference for business relationships. The conversation continued around Sarah as if she were invisible, discussing the requirements for a CEO's wife like they were listing qualifications for a job she could never fill. Sarah excused herself from the table and found refuge in the hotel's garden, where she sat on a stone bench and let the tears she had been holding back for months finally fall. The beautiful wedding that was supposed to celebrate their love had become a spotlight on everything that made her different, everything that would make Michael's life more complicated, everything that would hold him back. She thought about her career, her achievements, her dreams of designing buildings that would make the world more accessible for people like her. She thought about Michael's face when he talked about his plans to expand the company internationally, the light in his eyes when he discussed the charitable foundation he wanted to start. How could she be the reason those dreams became harder to achieve? When Michael found her 20 minutes later, her decision was already made. Sarah? What's wrong? He sat beside her on the bench, immediately wrapping his arm around her shoulders. She leaned into his warmth one last time, memorizing the feeling of being held by someone who loved her completely. Michael, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. If you could change one thing about me, what would it be? She felt him stiffen beside her, sensed the careful way he was choosing his words. Sarah, you know I wouldn't change anything about you. You're perfect exactly as you are. But there was something in his voice, not doubt about her, but maybe doubt about their situation, about the challenges they were facing, about the price they were both paying for their love. That night, Sarah wrote Michael a letter explaining her decision. She told him she loved him too much to be the reason his life became smaller, too much to watch him sacrifice his dreams for their relationship, too much to let their love become a source of struggle instead of joy. She planned to leave the letter on his pillow in the morning and disappear before the wedding, giving him the chance to build the life his family wanted for him. But Sarah had underestimated the power of a father's love, and Richard Chen had been watching, listening, and planning something that would change everything. Richard Chen stood in his study at 5 a.m. on what should have been his son's wedding day, holding Sarah's letter in hands that trembled with an emotion he hadn't felt since Michael was born. The letter, which Michael had found on his pillow just hours earlier, contained words that cut through decades of Richard's carefully constructed beliefs about success, image, and what really mattered in life. I love your son too much to be the anchor that holds him down, Sarah had written. He deserves someone who makes his life easier, not harder. Someone who fits into your world without requiring everyone else to adjust. I thought love would be enough, but I've learned that sometimes love means knowing when to step away. Michael had been devastated, frantically searching for Sarah while his mother handled the logistics of canceling a wedding that had cost more than most people's homes. But Richard found himself remembering something he had buried so deep he had almost forgotten it existed. The story of his own parents, and the choice his father had made decades earlier. Richard's father, David Chen, had been a brilliant engineer who immigrated to America with nothing but ambition and a suitcase full of dreams. He had fallen in love with a woman named Linda who was confined to a wheelchair after a car accident, but who possessed the sharpest mind and kindest heart David had ever encountered. Richard's grandparents had been horrified. She'll hold you back, they had said. Think of your career, your future children, what people will say. David Chen had made the choice that Richard now realized he had been unconsciously pressuring his own son to make. He had walked away from Linda, married a woman his parents approved of, and built the foundation of what would become the Chen family fortune. But Richard remembered his father's face in quiet moments, the way David would sometimes stare out windows with a sadness that success could never fill. On his deathbed, David Chen had whispered to Richard, I built an empire, but I lost my soul. Don't make my mistakes. Standing in his study, Richard realized he was watching history repeat itself, except this time he was playing the role of his disapproving grandparents. He was pushing his son away from genuine love toward the kind of empty success that had haunted his own father's final years. Richard had spent the last months investigating Sarah, initially looking for reasons to prove she wasn't right for Michael. Instead, he had discovered a woman whose achievements were extraordinary by any measure. Sarah hadn't just succeeded in architecture. She had revolutionized accessible design, won international awards, and was considered one of the most innovative young architects in the country. Her work had improved the lives of thousands of people with disabilities, and major cities were competing for her designs. More importantly, Richard had watched the way she treated people. He had seen her help an elderly man who had fallen on the subway steps, witnessed her patiently explaining architectural concepts to curious children, observed her genuine kindness toward his household staff. Sarah possessed the kind of character that couldn't be taught or bought. She was exactly the kind of person Richard had hoped his son would find. But beyond Sarah's individual qualities, Richard realized something even more profound. He had built a technology empire by recognizing patterns others missed, by understanding that the future belonged to those who could think differently. The world was changing, becoming more inclusive, more aware of the importance of diversity and accessibility. Companies led by people who understood these values weren't just more ethical. They were more profitable, more innovative, more successful in every measurable way. Sarah wasn't a liability to Michael's future success, she was the key to it. Her perspective, her experiences, her insights into accessibility and inclusion weren't disadvantages. They were exactly the kind of expertise that would make the Chen Company more relevant and valuable in the coming decades. At 6 a.m, Richard made a series of phone calls. First, he called the wedding venue and told them to prepare everything exactly as planned. Then he called his security team and asked them to find Sarah. Finally, he called Michael and told him to trust his father one more time. When Sarah was found at the airport, trying to catch a flight to Seattle where she had been offered a job she had previously declined, Richard's security team gently but firmly escorted her back to Manhattan. She arrived at the hotel expecting confrontation, perhaps even legal trouble for the disruption she had caused. Instead, she found Richard Chen waiting for her in the hotel lobby, holding a folder full of documents and wearing an expression she had never seen before, one of genuine remorse and newfound respect. "Sarah," he said, standing as she approached, "I owe you an apology. More than that, I owe you the truth about why I've been so wrong, and why today's wedding is going to happen exactly as you and Michael planned it." The ballroom at the Plaza Hotel had never seen a wedding quite like this one. As guests filled the ornate space, many of them expecting to witness either a cancelled ceremony or a reluctant compromise, they instead found themselves part of something that would change their understanding of what love, success, and family truly meant. Sarah stood in the bridal suite, wearing the dress that had been completely redesigned not to disguise or compensate for her stature, but to celebrate it. The new designer Richard had secretly hired was known for creating gowns that made every bride feel like the most beautiful version of herself. Sarah's dress was elegant and sophisticated, with intricate beadwork that caught the light and a train that was perfectly proportioned to her frame. She looked radiant, confident, and absolutely perfect. But the real transformation was in Richard Chen, who had spent the morning personally calling every guest to share something he called the most important business lesson I've ever learned. He had told them about Sarah's achievements, her innovations, her character, and most importantly, about his own father's greatest regret. By the time the ceremony began, the atmosphere in the room had shifted from curiosity and judgment to genuine anticipation and respect. Michael waited at the altar, his face glowing with relief and joy. When he had found Sarah at the hotel that morning, she had been hesitant to believe that anything had truly changed. But Richard had shown her the folder he had brought. It contained not just research about her professional accomplishments, but a handwritten letter from his father, David Chen, written shortly before his death. In it, David had described his love for Linda and the regret that had haunted him his entire life. "True love is the rarest treasure," he had written, "and anyone who walks away from it in the name of social expectations will spend the rest of their life counting empty coins." As the music began and Sarah walked down the aisle, she wasn't walking alone. Richard Chen had asked for the honor of escorting her, and his presence beside her sent a clear message to everyone in attendance. This wasn't a wedding being tolerated by the groom's family, it was being celebrated by them. But the moment that brought tears to every eye in the room came when Richard stood to give his father of the groom speech. Instead of the typical remarks about welcoming Sarah to the family, he used the moment to share his own transformation. For months, I've been acting like a man who had forgotten the most important lesson my own father tried to teach me, Richard began, his voice carrying clearly through the silent ballroom. I was so focused on what I thought success should look like that I almost destroyed the most successful thing my son has ever done, finding true love with an extraordinary woman. He turned to look at Sarah, and his voice grew stronger with conviction. Sarah Mitchell is not just my son's wife. She is one of the most accomplished architects of her generation, an innovator whose work has changed lives, and a woman of character that puts most of us to shame. But more than that, she makes my son happier than I have ever seen him. She challenges him, inspires him, and loves him for exactly who he is. Richard paused, looking out at the audience of business associates, family members, and friends who had come expecting a very different kind of speech. I built a company worth billions of dollars, but I almost made the same mistake my father made. I almost let prejudice and social expectations cost my family the most valuable thing in the world. Real love is not a limitation, it's the foundation for every other success worth having. The speech continued as Richard announced something that surprised even Michael and Sarah. He was restructuring the company's leadership, making Michael CEO effective immediately, and creating a new position, Chief Innovation Officer, designed specifically around Sarah's expertise in accessible design and inclusive business practices. The future belongs to companies that understand inclusion isn't just morally right, it's the smartest business strategy there is, he announced. As Richard returned to his seat, Victoria Chen stood up from her place at the head table. The woman who had spent months trying to prevent this wedding approached the microphone with tears in her eyes. "I owe everyone here an apology," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "But most of all, I owe Sarah an apology. I let fear and old-fashioned thinking blind me to the obvious truth that my son had found exactly the right woman for him." She turned to Sarah with genuine warmth. "Welcome to our family, not because we're accepting you, but because we're grateful that you chose us." The rest of the reception became a celebration that none of the guests would ever forget. Sarah's maid of honor gave a speech about her friend's courage and brilliance. Michael's best man shared stories of how Sarah had made Michael not just happier but better. More thoughtful, more aware, more determined to use his privilege and resources to make the world more inclusive. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came during the dancing. Richard Chen approached Sarah and asked for the honor of a dance. As they moved slowly around the floor, he said quietly, "My father spent 50 years regretting a choice he made in a moment of weakness. Today, I chose differently. Thank you for giving me the chance to be the father my son deserved, and the man my father wanted me to be." Sarah looked up at this powerful man who had learned to see past his own limitations, and realized that love really had been enough. Not just her love for Michael, but the love that had transformed an entire family. "Thank you for choosing love over fear," she replied. "And thank you for raising a son who was already wise enough to make the right choice." As the evening continued, Sarah and Michael danced to their first song as husband and wife, surrounded by family and friends who had witnessed not just a wedding, but a transformation. The little girl who had learned to navigate a world that wasn't built for her had found her place in it, not by making herself smaller, but by helping others expand their understanding of what love, success, and family could look like. The Chen family business would go on to become a leader in accessible technology and inclusive design, with Sarah's innovations helping millions of people around the world. But their greatest success wasn't measured in dollars or market share. It was measured in the love story that had taught them all that the most valuable treasures are often the ones that require us to grow beyond our assumptions to deserve them.